A simple moment at a WNBA Media Day turned into one of the most explosive debates of the entire offseason. Paige Bueckers stepped up to the podium, calm, composed, almost routine, but within seconds, everything shifted. A prepared statement about her personal life, her boundaries, and her relationship became the spark that lit up social media across the entire basketball world. Clips spread instantly. Opinions formed even faster. And suddenly, what should have been a standard press interaction transformed into a nationwide argument about privacy, fame, and power in modern sports. Some people saw strength, a young superstar setting clear boundaries in an industry that constantly demands access to every detail of an athlete's life. Others saw something different, a tone that felt sharp, controlled, and emotionally distant in a moment where the public expected openness. But beneath all the noise, one question started dominating every comment section, every debate, every analysis. When you become the face of a franchise, how much of your personal life still belongs to you? Because this wasn't just about one statement anymore. It became about the entire culture surrounding modern athletes, where every word is recorded, every emotion is judged, and every boundary is immediately challenged by millions watching from behind screens. And as the reactions grew louder, one thing became clear. This single moment didn't just answer questions. It created a much bigger storm that the basketball world is still trying to understand. And what Paige said next, or didn't say, only made the situation even more intense. Paige Bueckers and Azzi Fudd are not just two names attached to a headline. They represent a generation of women's basketball that grew up under the brightest spotlight the sport has ever seen at the college level. Their journey began long before the WNBA stage. At UConn, they weren't just teammates. They were part of a culture built on expectations, pressure, and constant national attention. Every game was televised, every performance was dissected, and every setback became a talking point across social media and sports networks. For Paige, the story has always been about resilience. From early hype as a generational talent to dealing with injuries and setbacks, she has lived her entire career under a microscope. Every move she makes is already framed within the idea of what she should become, not just what she is in the moment. Azzi Fudd's journey carries a different kind of weight. Known for her shooting ability and offensive skill, she entered the spotlight with massive expectations of her own. But her path has also been shaped by injuries and stop-start momentum, making her career a mix of brilliance and uncertainty. That combination alone has kept her constantly under discussion in basketball circles. Together, their connection naturally became part of the broader basketball conversation. Not because of drama, but because modern sports culture doesn't separate performance from personality anymore. Fans don't just follow stats. They follow stories, relationships, and emotional narratives that make athletes feel closer than ever before. As their names became more recognized, so did the pressure. Every interview, every appearance, every public interaction started carrying double meaning. Not just what they said as athletes, but what it represented in the bigger picture of expectations and perception. At the same time, the Dallas Wings context added another layer of intensity. A franchise trying to rebuild identity, relying on young talent, and operating under constant pressure to turn potential into results. In environments like this, every storyline gets amplified, especially when it involves high-profile players already under national attention. And that's where the emotional tension begins to build quietly. Because in modern sports, athletes don't just carry the pressure of winning games, they carry the pressure of managing narratives that form around them even before the season starts. So by the time Media Day arrives, this wasn't just a routine press interaction anymore. It was already loaded with expectation, curiosity, and unanswered questions that fans and media had been debating for months. And when Paige finally stepped to the podium, all of that history came rushing into a single moment that nobody expected to explode the way it did. The Media Day atmosphere looked normal on the surface, cameras rolling, reporters ready, and athletes going through standard preseason obligations. But underneath that calm setup, there was already an unspoken tension in the air. Because everyone knew what they were there to hear about. Not just basketball. Not just training camp. but the personal storyline that had slowly become impossible to ignore in the background of the Dallas Wings narrative. When Paige Bueckers stepped forward, the room immediately tightened. Not because of hostility, but because of expectation. Every reporter knew this wasn't going to be a regular question-and-answer session. Something had already built up around this moment, and now it needed to be addressed. Paige didn't hesitate. She didn't deflect. Instead, she delivered a prepared statement, controlled, structured, and intentional. She made it clear that her personal life would remain private, that certain boundaries existed, and that she intended to keep the focus on basketball moving forward. At first, it sounded simple, professional even, but the reaction started forming almost immediately. Because in modern sports media, tone often matters just as much as content. Some interpreted her words as a strong and necessary boundary in an era where athletes are constantly expected to share more than ever before. Others, however, felt the delivery was too firm, too closed off, almost like a wall being placed between the player and the public. And that's where the first real conflict began. Not on the court, not inside the locker room, but in perception. Clips of the statement began circulating within minutes. Short edits, reactions, commentary posts, each one framing the moment slightly differently depending on perspective. Some praised her confidence, others questioned her approach. And as always, social media amplified both sides simultaneously. But the real twist wasn't just the reaction itself. It was how quickly the narrative shifted away from basketball entirely. Instead of discussing preseason expectations, roster development, or team chemistry, the conversation became centered around one question: why this needed to be addressed in such a formal and final way. That shift changed everything. Because once a sports conversation leaves the court and enters personal interpretation, control becomes much harder to maintain. Reporters in the room sensed it immediately. What was supposed to be a short, controlled answer had now become the dominant storyline of the entire media day. Every follow-up question, every headline, every social media post began orbiting around that one moment. And within hours, the situation had escalated beyond anyone's expectation. Not because of controversy in the traditional sense, but because of interpretation. A simple boundary-setting statement had turned into a national conversation about tone, access, and the relationship between athletes and the public. And just when it seemed like things might settle down, the discussion took its first unexpected turn. Because the more people rewatched the clip, the more divided the reaction became, and that division was only the beginning of something much bigger forming underneath the surface. What started as a single media moment didn't stay contained for long. Within hours, the conversation around Paige Bueckers' statement stopped being about what was said and started becoming about what it meant. Different angles of the clip began circulating across platforms. Some cut it down to only the strongest lines. Others slowed it down, analyzing tone, pauses, facial expression. Every version told a slightly different story, and that's where the escalation truly began. Because now, it wasn't just fans reacting. It was analysts, former players, media voices, and casual viewers all interpreting the same moment through completely different lenses. One group framed it as maturity, a young superstar setting boundaries in a sports culture that often overreaches into personal space. They argued that athletes shouldn't be forced to explain their private lives to satisfy public curiosity. But another group saw something else entirely. They saw a tone that felt overly controlled. Too rehearsed. Too final. Almost like a message designed not to invite understanding, but to end the conversation completely. And that difference in perception created the second wave of escalation. Because once the debate moved beyond the original statement, it started expanding into something larger: how modern athletes are expected to balance authenticity with professionalism. In the middle of that growing discussion, the narrative began to shift again. Now people weren't only reacting to Paige, they were comparing how different athletes handle media pressure, how boundaries are set in public life, and how tone changes interpretation even when words remain the same. The story was no longer isolated. It had become symbolic. And that's when the second twist emerged, not from Paige herself, but from the environment around her. The Dallas Wings, already under the spotlight due to roster expectations and growing attention, suddenly found themselves pulled directly into the center of the conversation. What should have been a preseason build-up was now partially overshadowed by a media narrative they didn't fully control. Every discussion about the team began circling back to one idea: visibility. How much attention is too much? How much narrative control do athletes actually have in today's sports world? Even within basketball discussions, the focus subtly shifted. Analysts began talking less about matchups and more about chemistry under pressure. Not because anything had happened on the court, but because perception had already reshaped the conversation before the season even began. And that's where the real complexity appeared. Because the more the situation expanded, the less it was about one statement, and the more it became about how quickly modern sports can turn a single moment into a layered public debate. By this point, Paige's original message had already been repeated, dissected, and reinterpreted countless times. But instead of settling the conversation, it had unintentionally widened it. And just as it seemed like the debate might stabilize into two clear sides, a new wave of reactions began forming, more emotional, more polarized, and far more intense than before, pushing the entire situation into its most unpredictable phase yet. By this stage, the conversation was no longer just about a media statement. It had turned into a full-scale public debate that was spreading far beyond basketball circles. Social media became the main battlefield. Every clip, every quote, every slowed-down replay of Paige Bueckers' words was being analyzed from multiple emotional angles. Some people saw strength and composure. Others saw detachment and frustration. And both sides were becoming louder by the hour. What made the situation even more intense was how personal the reactions became. Fans weren't just discussing the statement, they were attaching meaning to it. They were projecting expectations, emotions, and their own beliefs about what athletes should or shouldn't say in public. On one side, supporters defended her right to privacy. They argued that no athlete owes the public details about their personal life, especially when the focus should remain on performance and team success. For them, Paige represented a new generation of athletes setting clear boundaries in an era of constant exposure. On the other side, critics focused on tone and timing. They argued that while privacy is valid, the way a message is delivered matters just as much as the message itself. In their view, the statement felt final, almost dismissive, as if shutting down curiosity instead of managing it. That contrast created emotional friction, because both sides believed they were defending something valid, but neither side was willing to fully accept the other perspective. Inside the basketball community, the conversation took on a more analytical tone. Former players and commentators began discussing how media pressure affects young stars, how narrative control can impact team environments, and how quickly off-court attention can influence perception of on-court leadership. Meanwhile, the Dallas Wings found themselves in an unusual position. Instead of being discussed primarily for roster development or season expectations, the team was now part of a broader cultural conversation about modern athlete visibility. Every mention of the team seemed to loop back to the same theme: attention. Not because of controversy in the traditional sense, but because of how fast narratives now form and spread in the digital age. As the emotional intensity grew, so did the polarization. Some fans began fully supporting Paige as a symbol of boundaries and professionalism. Others began questioning whether the tone of modern athlete communication has become too defensive in high-profile situations. And in the middle of all this noise, the original message, the actual statement itself, started getting lost. It was no longer just about what was said. It was about how people felt about what they thought was said. That's when the emotional fallout reached its peak. Because once perception becomes stronger than context, every side believes it is reacting to the truth, even if they are interpreting it differently. And just when it seemed like the conversation might slowly settle into repetition, a final layer of speculation began forming in the background, one that would completely change how people interpreted the entire situation moving forward. As the debate continued to circulate, something subtle started happening underneath all the noise. The conversation began shifting again, but this time away from the original statement entirely. What people were now reacting to wasn't just Paige Bueckers' words anymore. It was the meaning they believed was hidden behind them. In modern sports media, narratives rarely stay fixed. They evolve, reshape, and sometimes even detach from the original moment that created them. And that's exactly what started happening here. Discussions online began branching into deeper speculation about how high-profile athletes manage pressure, how teams handle constant media attention, and how personal boundaries interact with public expectations in a league that is growing faster in visibility than ever before. Within that environment, even neutral statements start gaining layered interpretation. Paige's message, originally focused on privacy and professionalism, was now being viewed through multiple competing frameworks. To some, it represented discipline and emotional control. To others, it reflected frustration with constant scrutiny. And to a smaller group, it symbolized something even broader: the struggle between modern athletes and the expectations placed on them by an always online audience. But the real twist wasn't the debate itself. It was how quickly the story began to detach from facts and shift into perception-driven storytelling. As more commentary videos, breakdowns, and reaction posts emerged, the original clip started fading into the background while interpretations took center stage. People were no longer responding to what was actually said, they were responding to how others were framing it. And that's where the situation became unpredictable. Because once a narrative reaches that stage, it no longer belongs to the person who created it. It belongs to the audience. Inside basketball spaces, analysts began warning about something bigger: how rapidly off-court narratives can influence on-court perception. Not because of anything happening in real time, but because of how attention itself can shape expectations before a season even begins. For the Dallas Wings, this meant something important. Every future media moment would now be viewed through a more critical lens. Every interaction, every press conference, every public statement would carry added weight simply because the conversation had already been amplified. And for Paige Bueckers, whether fair or not, this moment had now become part of her public identity, not defined by controversy, but by interpretation. Still, despite all the noise, one thing remained unanswered. The original intention behind her statement had been clear: establish boundaries and shift focus toward basketball. But in a media environment where everything is dissected instantly and amplified endlessly, intention and perception don't always align. And as the off-season continued moving forward, one final question began lingering across the entire conversation. Was this moment just a normal boundary-setting statement taken out of proportion? Or was it the beginning of a much larger shift in how the WNBA's newest generation of stars will be understood in the public eye? Because now, with the season approaching and attention only growing stronger, the next time Paige steps into a press conference, the world won't just be listening to her words. They'll be listening for what they think those words really mean. And that's where this entire situation leaves us. Not with a clear winner or loser, but with a much bigger question about modern sports, media, and perception. Because whether you agree with Paige Bueckers or not, one thing is undeniable: moments like this don't stay small anymore. In today's digital world, a single statement can become a full-scale debate in minutes, reshaped by clips, commentary, and public interpretation from every direction. So now the conversation shifts from the media room to the audience. Was this simply a young superstar setting healthy boundaries in a high-pressure environment? Or was it a moment that shows how quickly tone and perception can change the meaning of even the simplest message? That's the debate. And it's not ending here. Because as the WNBA season approaches, every press conference, every interview, every public appearance will now carry a new level of attention and a new level of scrutiny. So now I want to know what you think. Do athletes owe the public more openness? Or do they deserve complete control over their personal boundaries, no matter how famous they become? Drop your thoughts below, because this conversation isn't just about one moment anymore. It's about the future of sports storytelling itself.